strengths and challenges of your faith community, is this is going to get into getting you to do some work yourself. So you're going to start using those white pieces of paper over there and talking about the challenges and strengths of your own faith community from which you come. Then we're going to take a lunch, and then we'll talk about the strengths and challenges of Rochester. Okay, and then after that, we're going to debrief all that information. So those pieces of paper are going to end up on all these walls. We're going to debrief what we've gathered. Then this is the end goal. These last two things: identification of 2 to 3 areas of focus. Okay, so out of everything that we share throughout the strengths and challenges of your own faith community, the strengths and challenges of Rochester, is then we're going to identify 2 to 3 areas of focus that we can identify that we share together with the diversity of the places that we come from. Then the final step is the next steps. So what does this mean for us in this room moving forward? With the hope of, and I'm encouraged by the voices that have already shared, with the hope of developing a task force collectively of figuring out how we're going to address those 2 to 3 areas. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Any questions so far? All right. So, just a little bit of a exercise, Luke chapter 10. Let's just try to make it through this in maybe 10 or 15 minutes. This is the sending out of the disciples. Somebody want to go ahead and read this for us?
I can read it.
All right, go for it, DJ.
I have to stand up because we have certain traditions. After this, the Lord appointed 70 others and sent them on ahead of pairs to every town and place where he himself intended to go. He said to them, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go on your way. See, I am sending you out like lambs into the midst of wolves. Carry no purpose, no bag, no sandals, and greet no one on the road. Whatever house you enter, first say, 'Peace to this house.' And if anyone is there who shares in peace, your peace will rest on that person. But if not, it will return to you. Remain in the same house, eating and drinking whatever they provide, for the laborer deserves to be paid. Do not move about from house to house. Whenever you enter a town and its people welcome you, eat what is set before you. Cure the sick who are there, and say to them, 'The kingdom of God has come near to you.'" This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. All right, so let's just together as a group talk about some things that jump out at you concerning this passage.
The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few.
There you go. That's truth right there, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's really, really good. That's lesson number 1 about the shift in the church, is that we bought in the ideology that churches are big and everybody's on the same page and we're all moving forward. But as we look at this room this morning, the harvest, Rochester, is huge, but the laborers who are really committed to the work are very, very, very few. So don't be disheartened. Anybody else? What else do you see here?
I like the first part is that he sent them on ahead of him, pairs.
That's good.
And that's what is going to help us with seems to stand out.
Yeah, moving from silos to collective
That's
efforts.
right.
There you go. Yeah.
I like verse 5.
Go ahead.
Whatever house you enter, first say peace in this house. So to me, it's like whatever you touch, whatever organization, whatever company, bring peace, and sometimes it isn't that same energy, and he said it will return unto you. So bless whatever you're going into and, so it could be prosperous. That's what I get out of that first.
There you go, and the second part of that I didn't include, because it kind of goes on, and I wanted to keep it in a positive light rather than going in a negative place, but verse 10 is, wherever peace isn't received, then hey, you know what, say, okay, well, it wasn't received, so now it's time to move on, and not sit around and gripe about it, good stuff, thank you. Anybody else?
I like the Lord appointed 70 others,
Right.
and sent the Lord appointed.
That's good. Excellent.
I like 4. Carry no purse, no bag, no sandals, greet no one on the road.
Travel
I
light.
was hoping somebody was gonna lift that one up. Tell us more about,
Jesus is sending his disciples out with just what they have up here. Just what they're thinking, what they're saying. They don't need the purse, they don't need the bag, they don't need to look good or look bad. Just go out there and tell them about me.
let's dig deeper with that one too, because I think that, yeah, go ahead, DJ.
Well, there's the scripture that also points out to me from this particular one was about the Samaritan. And so on the road, it's very dangerous. So don't draw any attention to yourself. That's what it's saying to me. Don't carry anything extra that someone would try to come and take from you. Exactly. And don't greet anyone on the road. Go directly to where I sent you. And don't get sidetracked or distracted
Visions.
by anything else. Do what I appointed you to do. That's what it's saying to me. And yes, and I agree with John saying, hey, and you don't need anything else except for what you have. Take what you have and do what I told you to do.
I also see that goes piggyback on,
Mhm.
is that you totally depend on him.
There you
Yeah.
go. Big
You
That's
time.
where
don't need
yep.
to have all the, the knowledge and the education and
Mhm.
all of that, and to just go,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll be there with you.
So let's take that another step, because I love the whole idea of dependence, and what Lisa and I talk a lot about is getting back to a place of vulnerability. Before we started in some of our conversations, we were talking about how we get faith communities and community leaders and task force to work together in the midst of ego. And what we advocate for is less of self and more of coming together. And a lot of that requires vulnerability and dependence, not only on the Spirit of Christ, but also on each other. And so in this particular verse, and I'm glad you brought this up, is because this speaks to when we take nothing with us, we are dependent upon the people that we're in the midst of. I mean, speaking of the disciples, they're walking into a house, they're dependent upon that house for food, for shelter, for clothing, for sustenance. And there's something powerful that happens when we say to ourselves and other people, I ain't got this no more.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to rely upon all of us together to be able to take care of our basic needs. Community.
That's really good.
So that's kind of, a secret on where we're going end game with all of this today is less ego, more vulnerability, and more collaboration as we take nothing with us and find those. I need water. Thank you, DJ. Thanks for having my back. I need to get that tea bag in the middle.
I'm gonna go grab you one.
Huh?
I'm gonna go grab you
Oh,
one.
can you? Thank you.
Keep going though.
Yep, anybody else? Anything we're leaving out here?
Well, it says eating and drinking whatever they provide for the laborer deserves to be paid. So, you don't go in there saying, well, I don't like that.
Oh, that's good.
If they're good enough to provide it for you and to you, you humbly take it and say thank you.
That's excellent. Excellent.
I guess after that, not moving about from house to house. So I guess kind of put roots down somewhere and stabilize yourself. Start something, finish it, and don't,
especially in environments and communities where there's a lack of trust, especially around the vulnerable populations that, especially in the vulnerable populations that have been used, marginalized and mistreated and abused. That's key, because very few people are willing to commit themselves to each other in such a way that it's making a difference in their life, to know that I'm here to walk with you.
Yeah, one thing I never understood is I would always have friends, this may be a little off topic, but 1 week they're at this church, 2 weeks later they're at another church, and I'm like, I've been at the same church for like 20-something years, what do you got? You know, so I'm like, well, it might be the church, it might be you guys, you know, maybe you should pray about your heart, I don't know. But, yeah, just jumping from thing to thing to thing, you know. Like you said, how can people trust you? They don't know if you're gonna be around long enough to
That's really
see
good.
through, or, you know, help them with whatever their situation is, so, yeah.
Let your days be days and your nays be nays.
Yeah.
You're there, not wishy-washy.
Right, commit to, yeah.
Commitment's tough, isn't it?
'Cause everybody has a life or kids or anything else they got going on, but sometimes you gotta sacrifice.
Excellent, I love that. I've never heard that come out of this one before, so it's a new one on me.
It could also be about the vision.
Hmm.
That if one has a particular standard, and you go in this town and first place you stop, it doesn't meet your standards. And so you start to seek other places to meet that level of standard, that level of vision that you are accustomed to. And I think what Luke is trying to get us to grab hold to is that, you know, when you go out for the sake of the kingdom, don't be so much concerned about your position, whether or not you got a king size bed or a cart. It's kind of what I see in that.
That's really good. Realignment of expectations, huh?
You got it.
Ideologies. Very good.
Stepping out of our comfort zone, yeah, it ties in with that. In other words, we look for places that we feel comfortable because we can relate. But there's times where I think God is asking us to put that aside and do something different. And it's not easy to do.
It's a scary place.
Yeah, very
So-
scary.
That's kind of inherently implied, just, it's not stated there, other than the fact that there's just two words. They went, right? Yeah, thanks, DJ. They went. All right, thank you. Appreciate that. All right,
Again, thinking about what you're saying about standards. You go in, it says, going to, remain in the same house. I think part of that would be, you know, maybe your standard is up here, maybe they're down here. But what about bringing them up? Lifting people up,
that's good.
so that they have a better chance.
Well, I think that's the whole purpose.
Mm-hmm.
When you go out into these communities, is to lift up.
Yeah.
Piggyback off of getting out of your comfort zone. Jesus went to a lot of places that wasn't comfortable for him, especially in the synagogues. And he had to, you know, express the will of God, whether they like it or not. It wasn't comfortable. And you read through, you notice he had to come in, leave, come out, and go wherever.
I like the ending part of it too, is that wherever we go, when we go in him, and how he is sent ahead of him, but he's not leaving us alone. He's already there in the situation, and it ties into all of us, you know, just forgetting what we know, you know, what our comfortability
Yes.
and what our expectation is, but to keep our eyes on who has sent us and also bring him to them, because it says the kingdom of God has come near to you. So bringing bringing the kingdom or bringing Jesus to them
Mhm.
was the main idea that, hey, we came on his word, as Peter said,
Mhm.
all night long, I'm told, but on your word, because you said so. And just being able to humble ourselves and step out of all of the comfortability and the
Good.
expectation
There you
and our vision and
Yeah.
what we, religion and, well,
There you go.
okay, all of that stuff.
That's good. No, that's really good. And that's kind of how we ended up where we're at, as an organized church to some extent with institutions. All right. So I think we nailed all of it, and now you all have defined where we're going today, so that's good. So what we're gonna do in 45 minutes or less is we're just kind of gonna lay out for you a framework and a foundation of some basic principles on why we are doing what we're doing, what you all are doing, what you're doing together, okay? So then, as we move into identification of strengths and challenges in your faith communities, as well as in the city of Rochester, and then get to the end game, then this will start to make more sense, okay? So, the fact is that we have found ourselves as an institutional church, which you left us off with, in a radically different place than what we were used to. I remember, I'm 46 years old. I remember the time when the organized church, my own faith community that I was brought up with, the centerpiece of the community. So here's how it pretty much went down in a very gross generalization. We built buildings, we were in communities, we unlocked our doors. That was the center gathering place for the community, generally speaking. It was that civic place that people came together to build relationships, to find identity, and to interact with one another. Out of that, what often happened is if we build it, they will come mentality. And so that was centuries of the life cycle of the church, more than centuries. I mean, we're talking thousands of years, of doing this. You go over to Europe, they had the same exact thing. Massive cathedrals. We build it,
They will come.
they will come, and so it's not whether that's good or bad, it is what it is. It worked for that period of time, and people found their identity in place, okay? Around buildings. And we still have some of that that's being held on to. And so we're in a very sensitive place right now because things have shifted so quickly. More than any other time in the history of humanity is we've made some radical shifts. And if we're to be honest, we're all struggling together to figure out, well, what's our new identity? Because what used to be was place, people come, we have some good greeters, we have a good band, we have good worship, we have some good ministries, and you can build a church for pastors. Pastors out there, pretty darn easy. I remember a community that I was in, the first relationship I established was with a funeral director. And I did most of his funerals, 30 funerals a year. I built a church out of that because of place. That mentality has shifted, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and we're going to talk about that. So there's nostalgia around what used to be, okay? Is that fair? I have nostalgia of being a young boy in the Methodist church in my local community that my mom and dad took me to every single week. I remember the basement of the parsonage where we had Sunday school. I remember the relationships and the teachers and all of that. So there's nostalgia of what used to be. The shift that has taken place in part is how we connect with one another. And I'm not demonizing it, I'm just calling it out. this has changed everything. And so, we can go down the long laundry list of having a sob story about what this has done to humanity, but this is not going anyplace.
Right.
That's not going place. The internet's not changing. We have to figure out, how do we adapt as people of faith and faith communities in the midst of this shift of what now relationships look like. The key is I have a background in sociology. We're all human beings, and the reality is human relationships are, we need them. We need them. It's a point of survival, but it's a matter of how we get them, okay, and how we mitigate that. So how we connect has changed. The face of cities has changed. I know this to be true for Rochester. We're doing work in the Bronx, just a ways away from you all, and we're seeing this also in Detroit, where we're from. I should have said that. There's massive amounts of gentrification. If you're not familiar with that term, it's basically the face of cities is changing because of power and money and opportunity. And so it's pushing out people that have been in cities for some time that are in need, and it's bringing in a different class of people to live and abide in those cities. In Detroit, it's really sad to see what's happening, you know. So we've had the revitalization of Detroit, and people are all excited. Well, what that has done is created a city of wealth in the center of the city, but those who are impoverished, you know, the illusion, I'm just going to call it for what it is, in the white privileged mind is like, oh, well, we're revitalizing Detroit. It's like, no, what you're doing is you've changed its identity while you've disenfranchised people in need, and you've pushed them further out. And places that they've been able to live before and have resources, now they're homeless, and they're figuring out and they're trying to make sense of their life. So that has impacted cities and communities significantly. There is also the end of the majority, which is creating a certain amount of anxiety and stress. You know, again, we are looking more like a stew, a soup in the United States, rather than this is the main dish and here's the accompanying side dishes. So this is creating a whole lot of anxiety and stress in communities, because I mean, I'm thankful that it's happening, to be quite frank with you, because I think there's a lot of diversity and inclusion and beauty that comes out of that, but it creates fear and anxiety for those people who have been the majority for some time. Polarity and tribalism, that's a secondhand effect of moving from majority to minority, as well as an infusion of different races and ethnicities and identities. So what we've done in the midst of that, and I think that's very key in our, not to talk politics, but that's what's happening right now sociologically as well as politically, is we are very polarized at this point in time, which is a natural effect of figuring out who we are in the midst of this change. The age of the selfie, I've never understood that, I'm sorry. I try to figure that out. But you know, you look at different people's Facebook pages, if this is you, I apologize for saying so. But we've become more individualistic. So that's the whole point of this, is that in the world of faith communities, and I've seen this firsthand as a pastor, it has become a market economy. If I walk in and I'm here 2 weeks or even 10 years and I don't like what's happening, I'm not going to engage in a conversation about how to change and adapt and make a better version of ourselves together. But I'm just going to leave because I need to look out for what's best for me, rather than what's best for us together, and do the hard work of what it means to collectively work through some of those challenges. All right, informality. This is a big one. Institutions are no longer relevant. It goes back to if we build it, they will come. We've gotten into this place in worship communities as well as otherwise where we've become more informal, and that's just acknowledging the reality of what is. But institutions are no longer as relevant as they used to be. And even that, they're not as respected as they used to be either, because we have a generation of people, young people, millennials and X and Z, that are saying, I'm not buying into this anymore, especially if it's hurting people. I'm not going to be faithful to an institution just because, grandma or mom or dad or the pastor or some person of authority says, I need to commit myself to this. If it's creating injustice and it's hurting people, I have no affiliation nor desire to be a part of it. Does that all make sense? So this is all shaping the ever-changing world that we're in, as well as the ever-changing church.
John?
Yeah.
Sorry, just a quick question or comment. What you mentioned about the institutions are no longer relevant. A lot of the younger people are very observant. They watch. And what they see, they don't like. We don't always walk the talk. And they're so I agree with you in that respect. But the other piece of that is these, I would, for lack of a better term, call mega churches. With they're trying to do, in my estimation, they're trying to do too much. They're trying to be too many things to too many people. They have large numbers, but it's more like, from my standpoint, and it's more like going to a rock concert or something than it is to church. Now that's maybe me. Maybe I need to.
Well, I will say this in regards to what you said, is I think that there was a period of time from the 80s on, and we got into church growth movement cycles. That was an intentional effort, and there was a lot written about that, pastors as well as training around church growth. That was the whole initiative of faith communities for the longest time. And I think that there was an identification of this, that's where some of this came out with the individualism that popped up in the midst of that, is focusing in on becoming bigger, but at the same time, not really figuring out how we can create community, authentic community. So I think I appreciate your insights on that one. And then the last part of this is redefining the nature of relationships, and what do relationships mean? And it goes back to the issue of trust that you were speaking to. So those are some of the things that have played into an ever-changing world, but also an ever-changing church, and they're both connected. They're not on their own. So I'm going to let Lisa take this here. I'll give you this. What's that?
Just helps me.
Okay. What do you need from me?
I just wanna pop them off,
Okay.
so I don't jump
Yeah, that's
ahead
good.
and
Right.
know where I'm at. Okay, so this chart here, what we wanna talk about, when we say building bridges, the first thing that we want to absolutely acknowledge is that every single faith community has challenges, even the ones that look like they have it all together. I'm thinking about one of the terms that John mentioned, which is a term that we use all the time, the word vulnerability. There was a very affluent church that was a couple towns over from the community that John and I live in, and they reached out to me a couple years ago, and they had people that had trained to become Stephen ministers. And the head of the program said, you know what, I don't understand it, Lisa. No one is coming to us to share their problems with us. What's going on?
So we started unpacking it. And from the outside, this church was probably one of the most spectacular churches I've stepped into within a 50-mile radius of where we live. I mean, I was just blown away by the grandeur of it. And then you start looking around at the cars that are in the parking lot. Oh my gosh. Very expensive vehicles. And then I start looking at the people that are coming in and hearing about what this person does for a living and what this person does for a living and where they live. And so the perception is that life looks perfect. But you start peeling away the layers, and I started saying, well, tell me what's really going on there. Is there opportunities for people to be vulnerable? And as soon as I used that word, I could see him like cringing. He's like, well, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, that's when we pretty much pull out our cards, we lay them on the table, and we speak the truth. We share the good, the bad, and the ugly. And he said, well, he said, my gosh, he said, the people here aren't comfortable doing that. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, well, look around, Lisa. They want everyone to think that everything is perfect. And I said, well, that right there is what we need to work on. We need to unpack that because we know that that's not the truth. And we started talking about, finding ways to connect with people that were walking through that church every single Sunday, to find the ones that had kids that were addicted to drugs or alcohol, to connect with the people that were having marriages that were falling apart, to connect with the people that were having struggles with their faith walk. But it was all about finding a safe place to build vulnerability. So it has to start with us, and that has to be carried out. So that's the first thing that I want to say and make sure that everyone understands that. Vulnerability is where our power is as Christians. So we have to be willing to be able to express and identify what vulnerability means for us, to be able to teach that and carry that forward to other people. And once again, that's a place of discomfort, but the more we practice it, that is truly, I think, where the most sacred moments are held, is when we really create these opportunities for vulnerability. So we take that vulnerability and then we start looking, outside the walls of the church. And we know that there's always a common thread that is going to bind all of us. So we have to figure out what are the needs that bind us, not only here within this church, but when we step out of this church. What are the common threads that are happening to the people that live around us? So we want to always think in terms of we rather than us. What is going on here? What is going on in the church down the road at Reverend Patrick's church? What is going on? Good morning, how are you? Glad you're here. We have to break down that mentality of the us versus them. And we have to understand that the them really is us. So if we start dialing through that, that's when we can make these connections, because our job really is, as DJ was saying, is we're here to educate and evangelize. So
Right.
we can do, we know we can evangelize here, but that has to go outside. We always have to be thinking outside. So our success happens always when we focus outward. And that can be a scary place for us to go, right? Because let's face it, this is our safe space, right? We know when we walk in here pretty much what to expect, that we can meet each other, that we're coming in here with a common thread, that we're gonna vision and we're gonna do some really fun things this morning. But it gets scary when we step outside the walls of this church. Once again, that's where the vulnerability has to be always right in our hip pocket. We have to take that with us and carry that forward. So start asking yourself some questions. What does this community have a heart for? And that's always a really big question. But if you start, stepping back, what does it have a heart for? And maybe another way to look at it is, what are the needs of this community? Because if there's a need, we know that there's usually a heart that goes along with,
Mhm.
how do we take care of that need, right? You hit on one, that is near and dear to my heart, which is mental health issues.
Right.
The community that John and I live in, we do, meals every Monday at our church. And there are significant men and women that come through for meals that have serious mental health issues, serious. And finding ways to help them get mental health care, so allow them to be part of the community and know that they have an opportunity to use their gifts and be a vital part of the community. So you start walking down all this list. What are the needs that aren't being met? I mean, it's pretty easy a lot of times to say, what are we doing well? And we always want to keep that, on a priority list and be proud of what we're doing well. But then here's where we want to start dreaming and dreaming really big. And we put everything out there. What are the things that aren't being adequately supported in our community?